Well, welcome back to my weekly vlog, and I am so delighted to be sharing the screens today with Dr. Louise Newson. Honestly, I don't think she needs any introduction really, but just in case any of you happen to have missed so much of her wonderful work, and a lot of it here represented on Liz Our Wellbeing too, is just the, in my opinion, preeminent authority in the UK and probably globally on all things menopause and midlife for women. If I could give you a fanfare, Louise, I would.
Oh.
Welcome.
You're very kind.
No, it's really much deserved. And we're going to pick up today on something that's been really topical, and that is looking at the link with estrogen and the immune system on so many levels, talking everything from COVID to beyond. So in order to do that, would you like to give us a little bit of detail as to your background? Because many of us may well know you as a hormone specialist and an HRT advocate, but your training actually goes way beyond that, doesn't it, from the early days?
Yeah, so I'm a doctor, but I took a year out as part of my degree, and I did a BSc in pathology and immunology. So that's the study of disease, but also it included the study of the immunity and the immune system. And that was a long time ago. That was in 1992. So things, thankfully, have gone on and changed quite a lot. But what was very interesting, and it's really interesting now when I think about it, because one of the lecturers there, who I wish I could reconnect with, but sadly he's no longer with us, called Professor Stoddard, talked a lot about macrophages, which are a type of cells in our body. So we have lots of different immune cells, the white blood cells that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, and they all have different effects. And basically some of them eat the bugs or eat any infections. They sort of engulf them and eat them. A lot of them produce chemicals, and the chemicals will sort of kill the bugs or make them easier for these other cells to digest. So they're all working together. It's incredible how our bodies work, to be honest. These chemicals in small doses are really good because they'll kill just the bugs, but you can imagine in big doses they can kill and affect the tissues as well. And if you bang your arm, for example, you'll get inflammation, so you'll get swelling, you'll get bruising, and a lot of it is because these cells are just trying to work out what to do, and some of the chemicals will produce this swelling in the body as well. So we did a lot about diseases, how they occur, but this sort of talk, or this series of talks we had about these macrophages, really resonated with me. At the time I thought it was actually quite dull and boring, and now I'm looking back thinking this is actually really pivotal, because when cells are programmed wrongly, they don't work as efficiently, and we know that, and that's what happens with diseases, and a lot of cancers, for example, are genetically programmed. The programming goes, and sometimes it's the way we're born, sometimes it's our lifestyle. So you can imagine smoking is very toxic and can affect the function and the genetic makeup of cells, and the immunity is no different. So these macrophage cells, if they're working well, they're very efficient. If they're not working well, they go into this sort of pro-inflammatory state, which is actually negative for the body. And we know that if they're programmed wrongly, they can induce diseases such as heart disease and atherosclerosis, which is a fatty deposit with a furrowing of the arteries, increasing risk of heart disease. Also can increase osteoporosis. You know, right. Everyone thinks bone is very static, but there are cells in the bones that react to these cells as well. Also our brains, so dementia increases if these macrophages don't work properly. So it's really important that you think about our immunity not just to fight an infection, but actually if they don't work well, it can trigger disease too. Right. And so right. This professor kept talking about the macrophages, how important it was, and I thought, God, this is so dull. Can you imagine spending your whole life thinking about macrophages? But actually we've come a big circle, because now if you think about our immunity, certainly with COVID, we're thinking more and more, how can we get a really good immune system? What can we do that really works well? We know that eating healthily, exercising, we know certain medicines can boost our immune system, because we want this pro-inflammatory state to be switched off. We want, it's this whole sort of aging, really, if you like. And people now talk about aging, which is like inflammation leading to accelerated aging. So it's your biological age, not your chronological age. And when we talk about aging in medicine, it's not about having a few wrinkles or a few lines. It's about internally in our bodies, because if we age too quickly, we have these diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, dementia. And if any of you have heard me talk about diseases associated with the menopause, you'll realise that they're very similar diseases. In fact, they're the same diseases. So then you must think, hopefully, well, what is the link then? How are these cells changing, especially like these macrophages, our immune cells? And the big link with menopause is obviously estrogen. And then it's no surprise to know that we've got estrogen receptors on the membranes of these cells. So estrogen can stimulate these cells to work really efficiently. But we know if people have low levels of estrogen, it affects these macrophages and causes this pro-inflammatory, sort of nasty inflammation, if you like. And I'm sure this is one of the big reasons why.
Yeah,
yeah. So it's very. Sorry. So yeah, it is very interesting when you look back at a molecular level, and I think what's happened for the last 30 years or so is that people have just thought about menopause associated with hot flushes and a bit of an annoying menopausal women, but they haven't taken a step back and really reflected and thought, well, what's the issue? Well, we've got low estradiol levels. Why is estradiol important? Why does it cause this increased risk of diseases? And then when you try and work out why it could be, what's the common denominator, if you like, then a lot of this really then sort of makes sense. You know, when we have decades of living without estrogen in our bodies, these cells try and compensate. They just don't work well. You know, you can't drive your car without oil in it, can you? The body tries its best it can, but it means the immune system is not good. So we've got these other diseases, but then also our immune function is not so good. We know that women are more likely to have autoimmune diseases. So, for example, things like thyroid diseases, things like type 1 diabetes, celiac disease, far more common in women, and that's part of our immune system. And then we think, how do we fight infections compared to men? Well, most of us who have male partners know that man flu is really real, and they do go to bed when they have the same illness as us. And for years we've always thought they just because they don't cope with illness quite as well, but actually their immune system is not as efficient as ours because they don't have the estrogen that we have. So actually these poor men really do have a different disease manifestation because they don't have the same immunity. And certainly in my clinic we see lots of women who, once they take HRT, say, oh my goodness, I don't have that. I used to have 3 or 4 colds every winter. Yes. I'm not getting them. You know, and I've sort of been thinking about it quite a long time, and then thinking, well, it's more than a coincidence, because there's a big placebo effect with any drug that we give, and we know that there is a placebo effect with HRT and hot flushes, for example, because people expect the hot flushes to improve. But actually they don't expect, if I did a questionnaire on some of my patients and said, do you think taking HRT will improve your immune system and make you less likely to have colds? They'll think I'm probably absolutely mad and say, well, of course not. But when they're saying time and time again, actually I have far less colds than it makes sense, because we know once estrogen stimulates the cells, these white cells, these immune function cells, it can genetically reprogram them so they're more efficient, they work better, but it can change the number of them as well, the amount of these cells in our body, which is really important when you think of big infections. So we know, different types of hepatitis, even HIV, very different manifestations in men than women. And obviously, as a lot of you have heard before, we talk about COVID and how COVID infections, when women have it, especially women who have hormones in their body, they react very differently. We don't see women taking HRT who go to intensive care with COVID, for example.
This is just so fascinating, and there's so much to unpack there, if you like. I mean, firstly, the fact that there is this estrogen receptor on the macrophages. So part of our immune system is so intrinsically linked to estrogen, and that then giving women a natural advantage in terms of combating all kinds of diseases. Maybe nature designed us that way so that we would be better equipped to, defend the next generation, or through childbirth or whatever. I don't know. But this obviously is so timely. And are people now working on this? I mean, obviously you are working in hormones and menopause especially, so you're up close and personal with it, day by day, hour by hour. Is this connection with estrogen and our immune system becoming more widely known and shared? Because I have never sat in a doctor's office and had a consultation talking about anything where it's been brought up, oh, well, actually, if you need to get better, you need to have high levels of estrogen to bring up your immune system.
The short answer is no. Yeah. And as you know, I'm not a researcher, I am a clinician. But I do have, a bit of a geeky background, and I am interested in finding out more. And so I have been trying to engage with big research groups, because especially with COVID, there's a lot of research, fantastic research going on. And I have been talking to various people, including some very key people with COVID, and a lot of them say this is really interesting, let me get back to you, or yes, we need to do more research in this area. But actually people still aren't doing it because they some of them don't see it as a priority. We've had grants turned down because they say it wouldn't have enough impact on the global health of people. Well, 51% I think is quite significant.
Yes.
We do have some studies, which I've mentioned before, showing that women who take HRT are less likely to die from COVID. And some researchers I've spoken to have said, well, that's because healthier women take HRT, which you could argue is true, but my counter argument is that women are healthier because they take HRT, actually. And in these studies, when they've matched people for similar, in a study you want to try and match the treatment group and the non-treatment group, so when they've matched them for things like smoking and obesity and age, it still comes back that HRT seems to have a protective effect. And when you work out the reasons, like I say with immunity, it's no surprise. I've even spoken to some researchers who have got samples from about 15,000 patients who have been in intensive care with COVID, and they've measured levels of hormones, including estrogen, and they found that the estrogen levels were very low, in fact undetectable for most of the patients. But they came back and said, I think there's a fault in the machine. They haven't actually said that they think it could be related.
Why,
and I said,
would
menopause
they say? Why would they say there's a fault in the machine?
Because then when I said, well, that doesn't surprise me, and I think that is quite important actually, because low estrogen levels occur in the menopause. And they said, really? Do they? And what, does that last? And I said, well, of course it does. Once the ovaries stop working, you're not going to have estrogen in your body. So it's this whole mindset, I think, and I'm not blaming anyone, but I think what's happened is that people do not see the menopause as a health risk. They see it almost as just something that everyone goes through, so it therefore is natural. But they also think that women who take HRT either are failing because they've given into it, or it's because they're middle-class women who want shiny hair. They don't see that intrinsically estradiol is really important for our bodies. And then, with the immune system, but we've got it there showing that it's men rather than women who have gone to intensive care. Yes. My husband did a 12-hour shift in ITU a few weeks ago just to help them, and it was all men, and it's
really,
it's just frustrating, really, just not to be listened. And I don't mind if I'm proven wrong, Liz. I would really love someone to give me the science to show me that I'm wrong, because I feel sometimes like I am completely deluded and I need locking up. But no one can give me any science or facts or evidence to show that I'm wrong. So.
Yeah. I remember in the very early days of COVID that there were some studies, I think in America, where they were looking at giving men in intensive care estrogen patches. Do you think that men would benefit from estrogen as well? And should they be looking at estrogen in later life as well?
Well, I think it's very interesting, actually. Yes, and this study is fascinating. I spoke to the researchers a few months ago, and the reason that they did it is they have a 120-bedded ITU unit over in the hospital near New York, and they found that they just noticed anecdotally that they had no women who were on HRT and going into intensive care, and they thought, goodness, this is really interesting. So they wrote this proposal to get it done to put patches on people. Sadly, they didn't have a menopause expert working with them on the proposal, so it wasn't great because it was only giving patches for a short period of time, and patches don't always stick, especially if you're sweaty or you're a hairy man. So there were things that they hadn't thought of properly. But in fact, they didn't go ahead with the study because there wasn't enough interest, and that's partly because everyone's so scared of hormones. But if you look back, about 30 years ago, they used to give estrogen to prison inmates to calm their moods, actually.
Really?
And so men used to take it, yeah. To some men who were aggressive and hard to look after in prison, they did. But then a lot of men then developed breasts, and they found it. But that was higher doses, and that was for longer period of times.
Okay.
What I think is really interesting is one of the reasons that people often are going to intensive care with COVID is because they develop this cytokine storm. And cytokine, if you break down the word, cyto is cell, kine is a chemical. So it's a chemical produced from a cell. As I said at the beginning, our white cells produce chemicals which are good to kill the bugs. If they do too much, it's like just pouring acid on the tissues. It will damage them. If these cells become too active and they sort of go into overdrive, really, so they produce all these chemicals, which then causes a reaction, and then these cells produce even more, and you get this storm effect, as you can imagine, especially in the lungs, and that's one of the reasons people go to intensive care. We know that estradiol attenuates this cytokine storm, so it damps it right down. And so even giving it for a short time, it might just be a few days, might be enough for men.
Really?
And actually, if you were a man, you would... I would have thought if someone could, informed you properly that it's only a few days of a completely reversible hormone with no long-term side effects, then actually if it keeps you out of intensive care. And, my argument about all this is it's dirt cheap and it's safe. If I had a choice of being given, even if I was a man, if I'd been a choice of given a bit of estrogen, bearing in mind men do have estrogen in their bodies anyway, or some new biological drug which is going to really affect my immune system, then of course, why wouldn't you try a natural hormone first? It just seems crazy.
Is this treatment being used anywhere in the NHS? Is estrogen being given to anybody with serious COVID?
No, but estrogen isn't given to menopausal women, is it, Liz? We know that because so few... Well, so few doctors know about it. Even recently I was talking to a cardiologist because we were trying to do some research into palpitations because, as you know, they're very common in the perimenopause and menopause. And he was telling me how many women he has referred to his clinic, and he has so many he can't even see them all. And I said, gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if I could reduce some of these women coming to you? And I could easily do it, I'm sure, by just giving them some HRT. And he said, oh, really? He said, oh, well, I wouldn't know how to prescribe HRT. And this is a cardiologist, and we know that, as you know as well, women who take HRT have lower risk of heart disease, and it's more effective at reducing the risk of a heart attack than taking a statin or a blood pressure lowering drug. Whereas cardiologists, so people on the front line are not going to be thinking about HRT, and even one of the studies that I was looking at using the ISRIC data, which is the ITU data where they record everything in the UK, I spoke to one of the lead researchers a few months ago, and he said, these results are really quite important and significant about women taking HRT having less risk of death from COVID. But he said, of course, Louise, if you gave these people HRT, you're replacing one problem with another, because think about their breast cancer risk. And I just went, oh, really? You've got to You've got to realise that estrogen on its own is not going to cause breast cancer.
No risk.
And giving it for a short period of time, it's going to have no problems. And we know also the other counter argument which people give is about the clot risk, because people, as you know, with COVID have this hypercoagulable states. They're more likely to clot, and that's sometimes some of the lung injury. But actually, I keep going back to estrogen and estradiol. It actually it reduces our risk of clot in some people, because it, again, with these macrophages, it produces some good chemicals. There's one called nitric oxide, which helps to dilate the blood vessels. It can be negative against clot as well. So again, that's not a reason not to give it. So
No.
Louise,
it's
all just very, it's very interesting, but it's just, there's a lot that needs to be done.
So is there anything we can do other than, I guess, talk to our doctors and make them aware of some of the new research and just point out that actually estrogen is a key part of our immune system? Let's keep talking about it. Let's start raising awareness of our macrophages and their need for estrogen. I think, it's like anything, isn't it? Once you start putting this out there, and this is why I'm always so keen to talk to you about this new information, is because knowledge is power, and we need to get it out there. We need to share it. We need to talk to our GPs, to our medical friends, people working in the front line, people working in healthcare, practice nurses, all of this, midwives, health visitors, everybody, because once the information is out...
I think that's really important, and I think it is about, as women, to get the information ourselves and then sharing our knowledge with healthcare professionals, because so many healthcare professionals sadly haven't been given the information. But if you feed them some information, say, I have read that, for example, taking estrogen reduces risk of heart disease, and I would like to try it for my bones or my heart, then actually the good healthcare professionals will say, well, I didn't know that. Let me go and read, and I'll come back to you. And that's what we should be doing as doctors, because it's really hard for healthcare professionals to know everything. And often they've been trained by people who don't know the facts, but we've got the facts, and we've got the nice guidance that we need to work out of. So I think as women, we can be quite vocal and gobby when we want to, can't we? And I think we should, get support by listening to your work and to looking at the evidence. Don't just take us as two middle-aged women talking about menopause and immunity. Go and read some information. It's so easy now to Google and go even onto medical things. You can go to PubMed and read some really good references.
I was going to say,
just make sure the sources are good. Yeah.
Pick your resources carefully. PubMed is a very good and open access, which is good. Your website, menopausedoctor.co.uk, brilliant, amazing free platform. Your downloads are extraordinary. And we're all extremely grateful for the work that you do and continue to do. And you are such a welcome guest here. Please come back with more updates.
Absolutely.
Because,
thanks, Liz.
knowledge is power. So thank you. And we'll be spreading the estrogen and immunity words around as the new buzzwords, I think, for this new, whole new world that we're stepping into, hopefully, post-COVID.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. And don't forget that if you would like more, this little vlog goes out live every Thursday. You can click the little link below to subscribe, and hopefully Louise will be a welcome guest back here again soon. Thank you for tuning in.